It stretches across mountains and deserts, winding like a sleeping dragon through the heart of history. The Great Wall of China, one of humanity's most extraordinary achievements, was built long before machines, cranes, or modern tools ever existed. For centuries, countless hands shaped stone and earth into a line so vast that it could be seen from the heavens. Soldiers, farmers, and villagers labored under burning suns and bitter winds, turning hills into fortresses and valleys into barriers. They had no engines, no steel machines, only ropes, levers, and the strength of their will. Tonight, we will journey quietly back through time and discover how people built the Great Wall without modern tools, how they lifted stones, shaped earth, and carved their mark upon mountains using nothing but ancient ingenuity. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can return for more calm stories of how history was built by human hands, one quiet stone at a time. Long before the Great Wall stretched across the ridges of northern China, there were smaller, humbler beginnings. Earthworks and mounds built not to impress the world, but to protect villages. The idea of building a wall was as old as the fear of invasion itself. Long before engineers, dynasties, and armies, there were farmers who looked across open plains and wondered how to keep their homes safe. In the early centuries, before unification under a single emperor, China was divided into many small kingdoms and states. These regions often fought with one another, competing for farmland, rivers, and security. Beyond the northern borders lay vast grasslands where nomadic tribes lived, swift horsemen who could cross open terrain easily, their raids sudden and fierce. For settled farmers, whose wealth lay in harvest and home, these raids were devastating. And so, they began to build barriers. First, these barriers were simple: ditches, earthen banks, and wooden palisades made from local materials. Communities dug trenches and piled soil beside them, creating raised embankments that could slow or channel attackers. Over time, the embankments grew higher, the ditches deeper, and the designs more sophisticated. In some regions, thorny bushes were planted atop the mounds, forming living fences that grew denser with each passing season. These earliest walls were not yet the Great Wall, but they were its ancestors. They represented a new idea, that people could shape the landscape itself into a form of protection. Instead of waiting for invaders in open fields, farmers could stand atop mounds and watch the horizon. They could build towers to signal danger, light fires to warn neighbors, and use the land as both shield and sentinel. The building of such walls required no modern tools. People used what they had: spades made of wood or bronze, baskets woven from reeds, and the sheer strength of their bodies. Earth was dug from nearby ground, carried in baskets, poured into long trenches, and packed tight with poles and tampers. Workers stomped and pressed the soil, layer by layer, until the earth was hard as stone. It was a slow, rhythmic labor, the sound of shovels, the thud of tamping, the hum of voices working in unison. In dry regions, where stone was plentiful, villagers used boulders and rocks, stacking them without mortar, fitting each piece by hand. They used levers of wood to lift heavier stones, rolling them along logs when needed. There were no cranes, no pulleys of iron, only clever use of balance and gravity. The work was communal, a duty shared by all. Each man, woman, and youth contributed time and strength, knowing the wall would protect not only themselves, but their children. As small states grew into kingdoms, their rulers began to see walls not only as protection, but as boundaries of power. During the Warring States period, roughly 2,000 years before modern tools, rival states such as Qi, Yin, and Zhao began to build longer and higher walls to mark their territories. What had once been a village fence became a frontier line stretching for miles. Soldiers guarded these walls, and watchtowers rose at intervals where fires or smoke could be used to signal approaching danger. These early fortifications were built entirely by human hands. Tools were simple: shovels carved from hardwood, picks tipped with bronze, baskets, and carrying poles. Work animals such as oxen or donkeys helped move heavier loads, dragging logs and stones across the dirt. Ropes made from twisted hemp held everything together, from lifting frames to carts. Every stage of construction depended on teamwork and repetition. In the lush plains of northern China, Where the soil was fine and dry, builders discovered an ingenious method that would later shape much of the Great Wall: rammed earth. Layers of soil were poured between wooden boards and compressed again and again with heavy wooden rammers. As the boards were moved upward, the wall grew higher. The result was a solid, nearly stone-like structure, smooth, strong, and resistant to erosion. This technique required no advanced machinery, only patience and rhythm. The beating of the rammers echoed across valleys, a steady sound that marked progress as surely as the turning of a wheel when later dynasties arose. Especially under the Qin in the 3rd century BCE, these scattered regional walls became part of a greater vision. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, ordered that the old walls of different kingdoms be linked together to form a continuous barrier across the northern frontier. It was not a single wall at first, but a network of fortifications following the contours of the land, up mountains, across rivers, and through deserts. The goal was not simply to build, but to connect, to unify what had once been separate efforts into one vast defense. The workers who built these early sections were not professional engineers. They were soldiers, peasants, and prisoners drawn from across the empire. Some volunteered. Others were sent as punishment or as part of military duty. Yet despite hardship, the work continued, guided by overseers who relied on the simplest of instruments: measuring ropes knotted at regular intervals, plumb lines to keep walls straight, and water-filled troughs to ensure level foundations. They worked by the rhythm of daylight, rising before dawn and stopping only when the sun dipped behind the hills. Every material used came from the land itself. In some regions, builders used packed earth. In others, stone or fired bricks. Near rivers, they mixed clay and reeds, forming a tough, fibrous material that resisted wind and rain. The secret of the wall's endurance lay in adaptation. Each section built according to the terrain and the resources at hand. No machine could have done better, for the builders knew their land intimately. Shaping it with care rather than force, to imagine their work today is to imagine a world filled with sound, the scrape of wood against soil, the crack of stones, the call of overseers urging rhythm and pace. The air thick with dust and effort, the earth trembling with each new layer pressed firm. There was exhaustion, no doubt, but also pride. The knowledge that they were part of something vast, something that would outlast them all. As the years passed, the wall became more than defense. It became symbol of unity, endurance, and the reach of human effort. Though it began as local embankments and simple ditches, built with baskets and shovels, it grew into one of the greatest works ever made by human hands. And all without the aid of machines, only through skill, coordination, and an unending belief that through collective labor, even mountains could be tamed. Thus began the story of the Great Wall, not as a monument of emperors, but as the work of countless ordinary people who turned the earth itself into a barrier strong enough to shape history. When we think of the Great Wall today, stretching across mountains and deserts, it is easy to picture an emperor's dream, a grand design drawn on scrolls, executed with precision. Yet, for those who built it, the wall was not an abstract line across the earth. It was mud beneath their feet, stone against their hands, and sweat in their eyes. It was the weight of baskets filled with earth, the steady swing of a wooden mallet, the rhythm of human labor echoing against the wind. The Great Wall was not built by engineers with modern machines, but by people, hundreds of thousands of them, each performing simple, repetitive tasks that, together, became something immense. The true story of the wall is not only about kings or dynasties, but about the silent endurance of ordinary men and women whose tools were as humble as their lives. The first and most important tool was the shovel, not of iron or steel, but of wood and bronze. In the earliest periods, iron was scarce and precious, reserved for weapons. Builders used wooden spades reinforced with strips of bronze at the edge to make digging easier. Some were simple planks tied to poles, worn smooth by countless hands. Workers dug into hillsides, filling baskets with soil, sand, and stones. Others carved trenches for the foundations, measuring depth by eye and instinct rather than by precise instruments. Next came the baskets. Every load of soil, every handful of clay, was carried in woven baskets slung over shoulders or balanced on poles. These baskets were made from bamboo, reeds, or willow, strong yet flexible. Teams of 2 or 4 men would walk side by side, their poles bending under the weight, stepping carefully to keep the balance. Each journey from pit to wall was short, but repeated thousands of times each day. It was through these endless repetitions that the wall slowly rose. When the baskets reached the building site, the soil was poured into frames made from wooden boards. These were the molds of the ancient builders, forming the basis of the rammed earth technique that defined much of the early wall. Inside these frames, workers tamped the soil with heavy wooden rammers, solid blocks of wood attached to handles, sometimes weighing as much as a man's arm could lift. They raised them high and let them fall in rhythm, again and again, compacting each layer until it hardened like stone. The air would have been filled with the steady thudding sound, a heartbeat of effort that went on for hours without pause. Ropes, woven from hemp or twisted grass, tied the work together. They were used to lift heavy stones, to bind scaffolding, to measure distance. A rope knotted at regular intervals served as a simple measuring tool, each knot representing a fixed length. With these, builders could keep walls straight and even, checking alignment by sight along stretched lines. They used plumb lines made from string and small stones to ensure vertical precision, and simple wooden frames to keep corners square. Carts and sledges carried materials when the terrain allowed, pulled by oxen or donkeys. But in the mountains, where paths were steep and narrow, the work fell back on human shoulders. Stones were rolled on logs, dragged on sledges greased with mud, or levered up slopes with wooden poles. The builders used leverage, not machinery, the simple principle that a long pole could lift a heavy weight when pressed from the right angle. It was slow, deliberate work that required both patience and cooperation. For mixing clay or binding materials, they used spades and hands alike. Earth was combined with straw, reeds, or rice husks to strengthen it. In regions near rivers, builders mixed the mud with lime and sand, stirring it in large pits with bare feet until it reached the right consistency. The sound of sloshing, the feel of the cold mixture between toes, was part of the daily rhythm of labor. Nothing was wasted. Even the most basic material had purpose. Simple hammers and chisels helped shape stones. These tools were made from bronze, or later, crude iron, hammered by local blacksmiths who traveled with the work teams. Stones were split by heating them with fire and cooling them rapidly with water, causing cracks that could be pried open with wooden wedges. It was a patient, careful process. Not speed, but endurance defined the work. Food and water were as vital as tools. Workers carried gourds filled with water, drank from streams, and ate simple meals of grains or vegetables prepared in large communal pots. The rhythm of work was often set by hunger and daylight. At dawn, the first blows of tools echoed across the land. At dusk, smoke from small fires rose along the wall as the laborers rested, their hands rough and blistered, their bodies coated in dust. Yet, even in exhaustion, they took pride in what they were building, a structure meant to protect generations to come. The organization of such vast labor was a feat in itself. Overseers, often soldiers or officials, directed teams with flags or drums. Drums kept time for the rammed earth workers, each beat signaling when to lift and drop the rammers. The worksite would have sounded like a great orchestra of earth, the pounding of soil, the creak of carts, the calls of men, the steady beat of coordination. Women also contributed, though their names were rarely recorded. In nearby villages, they prepared food, carried water, repaired clothing, and sometimes helped in lighter construction, packing soil or weaving ropes. Their work sustained the builders, and without them, the wall could not have continued. Despite the harshness of the task, ingenuity flourished. Builders learned to adapt their methods to the terrain. In the deserts of Gansu, where stones were scarce, they pressed layers of sand, reeds, and tamarisk branches, creating a wall light but durable. In the mountains near Beijing, where stone was abundant, they used granite and limestone, fitted together by hand without mortar. In each place, the local materials dictated the technique. There was no single great wall, rather, countless variations, each shaped by geography and the people who lived there, What united them all was the simplicity of their tools and the greatness of their endurance. Every spade stroke, every tamp of the rammer, every step up a steep slope carried the same quiet determination. They built not with machines, but with rhythm, the rhythm of breath, of teamwork, of persistence that if you stood beside them centuries ago, you would have seen not a single grand structure, but thousands of hands working together, each one a small part of a vast design. The wall rose not by magic, but by repetition, basket after basket, strike after strike, day after day. The builders may not have known they were creating one of the wonders of the world. They were simply doing their work, one handful of earth at a time. And in that steady, patient labor lies the true marvel of the Great Wall. It was not only built to defend a nation, but to prove that ordinary people, with the simplest tools and the strongest will, could shape the very bones of the earth. To look at the Great Wall today is to see it winding endlessly across landscapes that seem almost impossible, climbing ridges that slice into the clouds, crossing deserts where nothing grows, and tracing valleys where the wind never rests. It feels as if it belongs to the land itself, rising and falling with its rhythm. But every stone, every mound of packed earth, was placed there by hand. To build across such unforgiving terrain without modern tools required not only strength, but an extraordinary understanding of the land. The northern frontier of China was never one kind of landscape. In some places, it was sharp mountain ridges, cold and steep. In others, wide plains gave way to dry deserts or rolling grasslands. For the builders, each section demanded new techniques, for the same methods that worked in one valley would fail entirely in the next. The genius of the wall was not in uniformity, but in adaptation. In the mountains, the challenge was both height and hardness. Paths were narrow, slopes were unstable, and the air was thin. Moving materials uphill without wheels or cranes was slow and dangerous. Teams of laborers formed long human chains, passing baskets of soil and stone hand to hand. Logs were used as rollers, and simple sledges were pulled by ropes along slopes greased with mud or animal fat to reduce friction. When even that was impossible, stones were carried on shoulders, one by one. Every meter gained meant exhaustion, but also progress. To cut foundations on the mountainsides, builders used chisels, hammers, and fire. Fires were lit against rock faces and then doused with cold water to crack the stone, a primitive but effective method that allowed them to carve ledges for the wall's base. The loosened rock was cleared by hand, forming narrow terraces on which walls could rise. On these precarious shelves, workers built low retaining walls first, filling them with soil and rubble to create a firm platform. Then, layer by layer, they raised the main wall above. The mountain wall was not meant to be smooth or even. It followed the ridgelines deliberately, using the terrain as part of its strength. A wall built atop a ridge doubled as a watchtower. A cliff became a natural barrier that needed little extra work. The builders understood this instinctively. The mountain was not the enemy, but an ally. By aligning their structure with the shape of the land, they turned geography into defense. The challenges of building in deserts were different, but no less formidable. In the Gobi and the Hushi corridor, stone was rare, and the ground shifted constantly underfoot. Sandstorms could erase a week's work overnight. To overcome this, builders turned again to local materials. They used layers of sand, gravel, reeds, and tamarisk branches, pressed together and packed hard using the same rammed earth method perfected in the plains. Each layer absorbed the movement of the shifting ground, keeping the wall stable even as the dunes around it shifted with the wind. Water, too, was scarce in the deserts, and this changed everything. Workers built wells along the route wherever possible, sometimes digging deep into dry basins in search of hidden springs. They carried water in leather skins and clay jars, rationing it carefully for drinking, cooking, and mixing with clay for construction. To survive, these stretches required coordination. Food and supplies were brought by caravans of camels, moving along routes parallel to the construction. Each group of builders depended on the next for survival, linked by necessity and shared hardship. The weather was another relentless opponent. In the mountains, winter came early, freezing tools and stiffening earth. In the deserts, the days burned and the nights froze. To continue work, builders began before sunrise and stopped only when the light faded. They wore simple tunics in summer, thick layers of wool and hemp in winter, their faces wrapped in cloth against dust and wind. When storms came, they sheltered behind half-finished walls, waiting for the air to clear before returning to their rhythm. Despite the hardships, the work never stopped for long. Orders from the capital ensured that progress continued, no matter how difficult the terrain. Supervisors divided the workforce into small teams, each responsible for a segment of the wall, often no more than a few hundred meters long. In this way, the labor was distributed, and even the most remote sections advanced steadily. Every few miles, a beacon tower was built, both as a signal station and as a resting place for the workers. These towers, built higher and stronger, became landmarks of progress, visible for miles across the hills. Transporting materials remained one of the greatest challenges. Where the land was too steep for carts, workers relied on wooden sledges. The sound of dragging wood across rock filled the air, punctuated by the rhythmic chants of teams coordinating their effort. In narrow passes, human chains moved like slow rivers, baskets swinging in unison. The organization of such effort was astonishing. Each person performing a small task in a grand design too vast for any single mind to comprehend. In some regions, the wall crossed marshy ground or river valleys. Here, builders laid foundations with wooden stakes driven deep into the mud, creating stability beneath the earth. In mountain valleys, they used stone from the riverbeds, carried upward in baskets, or rolled in wooden cradles. Each solution was born of necessity, shaped by the environment. The sight of the growing wall must have been both strange and awe-inspiring. Imagine standing in a valley and seeing a thin line of earth winding up the mountain before you. People like ants moving along its crest, lifting, tamping, calling to one another across the distance. The line disappears into mist, then reappears on the next ridge, gleaming faintly under the sun. To those who built it, it was not one structure but 1,000 small sections, each their world of effort, heat, and persistence. Without modern tools, precision came from practice. Builders learned to sense balance, to align by sight, to measure by rope and shadow. They read the slope of the land, adjusting their work so that the wall curved naturally with the terrain. There were no blueprints, only experience, a collective memory of how to make stone stand against gravity and time. In truth, the wall's greatest strength lay not in technology, but in adaptability. Where mountains rose, it climbed with them. Where deserts spread, it anchored itself in sand. Where valleys opened, it bridged them. Each section was a dialogue between human determination and the stubbornness of the earth. When later dynasties restored and expanded the Great Wall, they often built over these ancient foundations. The older walls, made of tamped earth, still stood, proving their strength. The new layers of brick and stone followed the same paths chosen centuries earlier, because the land itself had dictated the only possible routes. The wisdom of those early builders remained embedded in the geography. To build across mountains and deserts without machines was to face nature not as an obstacle, but as a teacher. The builders learned its lessons: where to build, how to balance, when to pause. Their hands carried knowledge as valuable as any tool when we look at the Great Wall today, winding across peaks and dunes, we are not only seeing a monument of stone and earth. We are seeing the record of human patience. Thousands of people who, with nothing but will and understanding, turned impossible landscapes into pathways of defense. Each stone tells of a hand that placed it. Each ridge remembers the echo of footsteps that climbed it. Together, they remind us that even in the harshest places, human beings have always found ways to build, endure, and belong. Among all the ancient techniques used to build the Great Wall, one method stood at the heart of it: the art of rammed earth construction. It was simple, quiet, and astonishingly effective. With no machines, no cement, and no modern materials, people found a way to turn the loose soil beneath their feet into something nearly as hard as stone. This technique allowed the wall to rise across deserts, plains, and mountains alike, a triumph of patience, rhythm, and understanding of the earth itself. The principle was easy to describe, yet incredibly laborious in practice. Builders began by constructing wooden frames, two parallel boards held upright by stakes, forming a long, narrow trough. Into this, They poured layers of earth, about a few inches thick each time. Then came the heart of the work, the ramming. With heavy wooden tools shaped like hammers or clubs, laborers pounded the earth over and over until it compacted tightly. When one layer was firm, another was poured, and the process began again. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the wall grew upward, each strike binding the soil into strength. The sound of rammed earth work was steady and rhythmic, a deep, dull thud, repeated in endless succession. Teams worked in coordination, their movements almost musical, one side striking as the other lifted. From a distance, it must have sounded like a slow drumbeat rolling across the plains, echoing between the hills. This was not the noise of machines or engines, but the living pulse of human effort. The materials themselves came from the land. Builders used the local soil, carefully chosen for balance. Not too sandy, not too clay-heavy. In dry regions, they mixed it with straw, reeds, or rice husks to give it structure. In colder climates, lime and gravel were added for hardness. Sometimes, water was poured in to make the earth easier to compact. Other times, builders worked with it dry, relying on shear force to compress it. Each handful of soil was tested by feel, each mixture adjusted by experience rather than formula. The process demanded strength, but even more so, patience. Each section of wall, perhaps only a meter high and a few meters long, could take several days to finish. The builders could not rush, for if the earth was not packed tightly enough, it would crumble in the rain. If packed too hard too soon, it could crack. They learned to read the sound of the rammers, the change in tone that told them the earth was ready. It was an art of listening as much as of labor. The rammed earth walls were not uniform. Their color reflected the land they came from. Pale yellow in the lush plains, reddish brown in the desert, gray near the mountains. From afar, the wall seemed to grow straight out of the ground, its hues blending naturally with the hills around it. Even centuries later, many of these walls still stand, weathered but strong, because they were built not against the earth but in harmony with it. The structure of a rammed earth wall was deceptively simple. Once one layer of the frame was complete, the wooden boards were lifted upward, leaving the hardened earth below as a foundation for the next section. The boards were secured with wooden pegs and ropes, adjusted by eye to ensure alignment. In some places, the walls were reinforced with layers of reeds or brushwood placed horizontally between earth layers, a primitive form of internal support that helped resist cracking in areas exposed to heavy rain. Builders coated the finished walls with a layer of clay mixed with straw or with lime plaster. This formed a protective skin that repelled water and added durability. The surface, when dry, became smooth and solid, catching the light like sun-baked stone. Over time, this surface hardened even further, compacted by wind and weather until it was nearly as firm as rock. What made this method so enduring was its flexibility. Stone was expensive and scarce in some regions, but earth was everywhere. Rammed earth construction allowed builders to use whatever lay beneath their feet. The wall became a reflection of its surroundings. Earth turned into architecture. In this sense, every section of the Great Wall was unique, shaped by its environment and by the hands that built it. The technique also had a remarkable efficiency. Rammed earth walls were thick, often several meters wide at the base, tapering slightly as they rose. This made them strong against both weather and attack. Even when centuries of wind and rain wore away the surface, the compacted core remained firm. Archaeologists today can still see the tool marks from the ancient rammers, faint impressions in the hardened soil, the fingerprints of long-forgotten laborers, for those who worked with rammed earth. The process was both exhausting and strangely meditative. The repetition, the rhythm, the slow transformation of loose dust into solid wall. It created a sense of quiet progress. Workers could see the results of their effort in the growing height of the structure, each layer like a page in a book of endurance. It was work that demanded cooperation. One person could not build a wall alone. It took teams moving in perfect coordination, each depending on the other's pace. Tools for this craft were simple but carefully made. The rammers were often carved from hardwood such as elm or oak, shaped so that the handle and head balanced evenly. Some were round, others flat. A well-used rammer grew smooth and dark with sweat and friction, its surface polished by years of use. These tools were precious, passed from one worker to another, repaired, and reused over many seasons. There was also a science to the layering. Builders alternated between coarse and fine materials, knowing that this combination gave the wall resilience. Fine soil filled the gaps between larger grains, creating a dense matrix. The result was a structure capable of lasting not for years, but for centuries. Where modern cement might crack, the ancient rammed earth flexed gently with the land, absorbing changes without breaking to eye in the mountains. The technique was adapted to fit uneven ground. Instead of level courses, the builders rammed the earth along the slope, creating steps that followed the terrain. In deserts, where sand alone was too loose, they added layers of gravel and brush to give the wall weight and texture. Each region developed its own variation, an evolving conversation between people and place. When later dynasties began to rebuild parts of the wall with brick and stone, they often laid these new materials directly over the old rammed earth cores. The ancient foundations, though made of soil, were still strong enough to bear the weight. This durability is perhaps the greatest testament to the skill of those early builders. What they made by hand has endured wind, frost, and centuries of silence. To imagine them at work is to picture a long line of men and women under the open sky. Their movements are slow but steady. Dust rises with every strike, hanging in the sunlight. Voices murmur softly, instructions, encouragement, the rhythm of teamwork. The sound of the rammers rises and falls like a heartbeat, carrying across the fields. In that quiet repetition, they turn the earth into memory, each blow echoing through time. The art of rammed earth construction was never about speed or spectacle. It was about trust in the materials, in one another, in the belief that small, steady effort could create something enduring. It was a dialogue between humanity and the land, where patience became strength. Even now, when modern machines can build walls in days, there is something deeply human in the slow, careful craft of ramming earth. It reminds us that progress is not always measured in speed, but in endurance. The Great Wall's ancient builders understood this truth better than most. With nothing more than wood, soil, and rhythm, they created something that would stand long after their own names were forgotten. When the Great Wall was finally standing, its endless ridges stretching like a scar across the mountains and plains, its purpose was not only to divide or defend. It was also to shelter those who lived and watched upon it. For behind every stretch of stone and packed earth stood people, soldiers, messengers, cooks, herders, and watchmen, whose daily lives turned the wall from a structure of defense into a living frontier. To serve on the Great Wall was both an honor and a hardship. Soldiers stationed there lived at the very edge of the empire, far from the warmth of cities and markets. Their task was to guard, to observe, and to endure. They watched the horizon for dust clouds that might signal riders approaching from the north. They lit fires to send warnings that could travel hundreds of miles in a single night. And in the long, quiet hours between alarms, they waited, through freezing winters, scorching summers, and the endless winds that swept the steppe. The wall itself was more than a barrier. It was an entire system of life. Along its length, at intervals of only a few hundred meters, stood the watchtowers, square, solid structures rising higher than the wall, their tops flat and open to the sky. From these towers, soldiers could see great distances. During the day, they used smoke to signal. At night, they lit beacon fires. In this way, messages could pass from tower to tower, carrying warnings faster than any rider could travel. It was one of the earliest networks of long-distance communication in the world. The towers were also shelters. Inside, narrow stairways led up to the platform. Below, small rooms served as quarters or storerooms, with space for food, weapons, and sleeping mats. The walls were thick, keeping out wind and cold. Fires were built in clay stoves, their smoke vented through small holes in the wall. By night, the towers glowed faintly with warmth, tiny pockets of life in a vast landscape of darkness. Between the towers stood garrisons, small fortresses where groups of soldiers lived for months or even years at a time. These outposts were self-contained worlds. Each had barracks, kitchens, stables, and small courtyards for training or drying supplies. Some were large enough to hold families, for a few soldiers brought their wives or children turning lonely outposts into small communities. The sound of conversation, the clatter of cooking pots, and the neigh of horses filled the air around the fort walls. Daily life followed a strict rhythm. At dawn, the first guards climbed the towers to scan the horizon. Others fetched water, swept the courtyards, and tended fires. Horses were fed and brushed, weapons checked and oiled. The soldiers trained in formation, practicing archery and drills to keep discipline sharp. But beyond these routines, much of the day was spent in waiting. Endless hours of quiet patrols, repair work, and observation. The wall demanded constant maintenance. Cracks filled, battlements rebuilt, ladders replaced. The same hands that once built it now preserved it. Meals were simple but sustaining. Grain was the main staple, usually millet, wheat, or rice, cooked into porridge or flat cakes. Vegetables were dried and stored for winter. Meat was scarce, reserved for special days or sent in salted form from supply caravans. Water came from wells or collected rain, though in desert regions it had to be carried for miles. Tea, when available, was a treasured comfort, its warmth offering a brief escape from the cold winds. Winters along the wall were especially harsh. The northern winds swept down from the steppe, howling through the towers and biting at exposed skin. Soldiers wrapped themselves in layers of wool and fur, their breath freezing in the air. Fires were kept burning day and night, and sentries rotated frequently to keep from losing feeling in their hands. In summer, the heat could be just as cruel. The stone radiated warmth, and the glare of the sun on pale earth was blinding. Still, the watch never ended. The wall demanded vigilance in every season. Isolation shaped the lives of those stationed there. Months could pass without seeing traders or travelers. Letters from home arrived rarely, carried by government couriers moving along supply routes. To fight loneliness, soldiers carved songs and poems into the walls of their watchtowers. Some verses still survive, simple lines about home, longing, and endurance. One might imagine them whispering their words into the wind, hoping their voices might somehow reach their distant families. Despite the hardships, there was pride in service. To guard the frontier was to defend the empire itself, to stand where few dared to live. Each soldier knew that the wall's safety depended on his watchfulness, and that the peace of villages far behind the lines rested on his endurance. In this sense, the Great Wall was not only a physical defense, but also a moral one, a test of discipline, loyalty, and courage. The system of signaling across the towers was one of the most remarkable aspects of life along the wall. When scouts spotted movement in the distance, perhaps riders, perhaps a caravan, they reported to the tower chief. If danger was confirmed, fires were lit at once. A single column of smoke might mean a small incursion. Several fires burning together could signal a large force. The next tower, seeing the smoke, would repeat it, and so on, carrying the warning along the entire frontier. In clear weather, the message could travel hundreds of miles in a single day. To maintain this network required discipline and coordination. Every tower had supplies of dried grass, oil, and wood for fires. Soldiers practiced lighting signals quickly, even in high winds. In storm or snow, they used mirrors and flags by daylight, torches by night. The rhythm of these signals became as much a part of daily life as meals or patrols. Trade and communication slowly grew around the wall. Merchants traveled along its base, exchanging goods between regions. Small villages sprang up nearby, supplying the garrisons with food and materials. Farmers tilled fields in the valleys below, their crops protected by the soldiers above. Life along the wall became a narrow but enduring belt of civilization, a line of human presence stretching across wilderness. And yet, it was a lonely life. When night fell and the fires burned low, the world seemed immense and silent. The stars above the wall shimmered like frost, and the wind carried the sound of wolves across the plains. From the towers, soldiers watched the darkness, wondering what moved beyond their sight. They were both guardians and prisoners of their post, bound to the wall that protected others. Still, there were moments of beauty. The dawn light over the mountains, turning the wall gold. The first warmth of spring after a long, bitter winter. The sight of travelers arriving safely under the soldiers' protection. These quiet moments reminded them why they endured, because their labor, their patience, and their watchfulness were what allowed peace to exist behind them. In time, generations of soldiers would live and die along the wall. Their names were rarely recorded, their stories mostly forgotten, but their presence was what kept the wall alive. The Great Wall was not merely a monument of earth and stone, it was a monument of lives. Each watchtower was a home, each patrol a step in a journey that stretched across centuries. Even now, when one walks along the ruins, the echoes remain. The sound of boots on stone, the faint trace of smoke-stained walls, the feeling of solitude beneath a vast sky. The wall endures not only as a symbol of power, but as a testament to endurance, to the people who guarded it, lived beside it, and, through their quiet service, made it eternal. The Great Wall may seem like a single, silent monument, a vast ribbon of stone and earth stretching across ridges and valleys. But behind every visible section lay an invisible network of labor, supply, and planning. The building of the wall did not end when the last stone was placed. It continued through the endless movement of food, tools, clothing, and materials needed to sustain both the workers and the soldiers who lived along it. The true greatness of the wall was not only in its height or length, but in the hidden effort that kept it alive. To understand how such a structure could survive for centuries, one must imagine the thousands of small paths and roads that once ran alongside it. From distant farms and villages, caravans of oxen and donkeys carried grain, dried vegetables, meat, and salt to the garrisons stationed across the northern frontier. Water barrels creaked on carts, firewood was bundled high, and cloth, ropes, and leather came from the workshops of the interior provinces. Every journey to the wall was long and heavy, yet without these supply lines, the soldiers could not have lasted a single season. Organizing this system required immense coordination. In the early dynasties, the imperial government appointed officials whose sole duty was to manage provisions for the frontier. They mapped routes, measured distances, and established way stations, small rest posts spaced evenly along the supply roads. These stations stored reserves of food and fodder, allowing caravans to travel in stages. Messengers on horseback carried instructions, reports, and requests for more supplies. The empire's communication network was as vital as its walls. The most important resource of all was food. The wall stretched across regions where farming was difficult, and local soil was often too dry or rocky for crops. To feed the soldiers, grain had to be transported from fertile regions far to the south. Entire convoys of carts moved northward for weeks, each loaded with sacks of millet, barley, or rice. Some records from later dynasties mention that for every 3 sacks of grain sent to the frontier, only 1 reached the soldiers, the rest consumed by transport animals or lost to spoilage along the way. Still, the system endured, driven by necessity. Salt and tea were also essential. Salt preserved food and replenished strength in the harsh climates, while tea became a daily comfort for those enduring the cold. These items came in compact bricks, easier to transport and store. Even so, they were precious. A single measure of salt or a handful of tea leaves could be traded for several days' labor. To maintain morale, commanders ensured that soldiers received these small comforts when possible. Water posed a greater challenge. In mountain regions, streams and springs provided enough for the garrisons. But in the deserts, wells had to be dug deep into dry basins. Teams of diggers and engineers worked tirelessly to locate underground water, using knowledge passed down through generations, the color of soil, the growth of certain plants, or the flight of insects that hinted at hidden moisture. In places where water could not be found, it was brought in clay jars by camel caravans, each jar guarded like treasure. Firewood and building materials also needed constant replenishment. The cold winds of the frontier demanded fuel for warmth, cooking, and signaling fires. Woodcutters traveled in groups to the nearest forests, cutting branches and bundling them into great piles. In treeless regions, dried grasses or animal dung served as substitutes. For construction and repair, local quarries provided stone, while clay pits near riverbanks supplied material for bricks and tiles. Workshops near garrisons shaped these into uniform pieces, using simple molds and sun-drying before firing them in open kilns. Behind every soldier on the wall stood an army of workers who never wore armor. Craftsmen repaired weapons, fletchers made arrows, and blacksmiths forged iron fittings. Seamstresses in nearby villages stitched uniforms and patched torn clothing. Farmers grew crops specifically for the garrisons, and transporters risked storms and raids to deliver their goods. Even small details, oil for lamps, thread for stitching, straw for bedding, came from somewhere, carried by someone. The Great Wall was sustained by the hands of an unseen multitude. Seasonal changes brought their own demands. Before winter, supply caravans doubled their efforts, sending extra stores of grain and firewood to last through the cold months. Animals were fitted with heavy harnesses, wagons reinforced against snow and ice. Roads, often little more than dirt tracks, turned to frozen ruts, slowing travel. But the work continued regardless, for the wall could not be left unguarded. In summer, heat made the journeys equally hard, and the caravans traveled at dawn and dusk to avoid the sun. Dust and fatigue were constant companions, yet the movement of supplies never ceased. Coordination between provinces was crucial. The empire divided responsibility for the wall among administrative regions, each tasked with supporting a particular section. Taxes collected from farmers and merchants were converted into grain, iron, or cloth, all funneled northward. Local governors were required to submit regular reports confirming that their quotas were met. Failure meant severe punishment. For the safety of the frontier depended on their diligence. It is easy to imagine the great supply roads, narrow tracks winding through valleys, the sound of wooden wheels creaking under weight, the shouts of drivers urging animals forward. Dust hung in the air, rising in clouds behind each convoy. At night, the travelers camped beside the road, cooking simple meals over small fires, their silhouettes flickering in the dark. They were not soldiers, yet their role was as vital as any warriors. Even the act of transporting stones and bricks was part of this hidden system. In regions where the wall was made of fired brick, kilns were built along the route, often miles from the construction site. Workers carried raw clay to the kilns, baked the bricks, then loaded them onto sledges or carts. From there, the bricks traveled one relay at a time, passed from one group to another until they reached the wall. It was a slow, patient process, repeated countless times. The people who maintained these supply lines faced dangers of their own. Bandits roamed the borderlands, and sudden storms or landslides could destroy entire caravans. Yet the work continued with quiet persistence. For every soldier who watched from a tower, there were dozens of laborers who ensured that he had food to eat, water to drink, and fuel for his fire. Communication between the supply bases and the wall relied on couriers. These messengers rode swift horses along designated routes, carrying bamboo slips inscribed with reports and requests. They traveled day and night, stopping only at relay stations where fresh horses waited. The fastest could cover hundreds of miles in a few days. The empire's heartbeat pulsing between the frontier and the capital. This hidden network, the roads, the wells, the workshops, the hands, was what made the Great Wall possible. Without it, the stones would have fallen silent, abandoned to wind and time. The wall's endurance was not just a matter of construction, but of maintenance, the continuous effort to feed, supply, and repair what had been built. Even centuries later, the remains of this unseen infrastructure can still be found. Ancient roadbeds carved into rock, collapsed storehouses, and the traces of old kilns mark the paths where caravans once moved. They are the footprints of an invisible army, the nameless workers and transporters whose effort bound the empire together. To build the Great Wall was to create not just a barrier, but a living system, one that stretched from the farms of the interior to the farthest watchtowers under the northern stars. It was a masterpiece not only of architecture, but of organization and endurance, and perhaps that is what makes it so quietly remarkable. The Great Wall was not built in a single heroic moment, but sustained through the patient, daily labor of countless people whose names history has forgotten. Their footsteps formed the veins that fed the wall's heart. Without them, the stones would have crumbled long ago. Long after the dust of construction had settled, the Great Wall stood not merely as a line of defense, but as a silent symbol of something far greater. To the empires that rose and fell behind it, the wall represented unity, the strength of many regions bound under one purpose. And to the generations who looked upon it from the valleys below, it spoke of endurance, the quiet persistence of human effort against time, nature, and fear. When the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, ordered the linking of old frontier walls into one vast barrier. His aim was practical, to keep invaders out and to protect the fertile heartlands of his new empire. But in doing so, he created more than a fortress. He created a vision of collective identity, a single structure that stretched across mountains, deserts, and rivers, uniting distant provinces under one command. For the first time in history, people from different lands, speaking different dialects, and living under different customs, worked together for a common goal. The wall became the spine of a newly unified realm that it is easy to imagine the sight of it then, a ribbon of earth winding through the horizon, its surface alive with workers and soldiers, its towers glowing with fire at night. Every kingdom, once separate, now contributed its strength. The stones of the east met the earth of the west, the timber of the south met the sand of the north. In this vast collaboration, the wall became not just a boundary, but a bridge between people. Yet unity came at a cost. The work demanded immense sacrifice. Laborers toiled for years far from home, their efforts swallowed by the endless rhythm of construction. The wall's endurance, even in its earliest years, was paid for with exhaustion and human struggle. But in that struggle, something deeper was forged. The idea that a nation could stand together against the challenges of time and nature. As centuries passed, dynasties changed. The Han extended the wall farther west, into the deserts and along the Silk Road. The Ming rebuilt it in stone and brick, strengthening it into the form we recognize today. Each dynasty added its own touch, its own layer of meaning. And yet, through every transformation, the wall remained constant in purpose, a reminder of shared identity and perseverance. The wall's endurance across such vast distances and centuries reflects not only physical strength, but also a moral one. To build it was to declare faith in continuity, to trust that what was made by human hands could last beyond generations. In this sense, the Great Wall was a dialogue with time. Each dynasty that repaired it spoke to the next, saying, "We will continue where you left off." In many ways, the wall became a mirror of the people themselves. When the empire was strong, the wall stood firm, well guarded and maintained. When the empire weakened, the wall began to crumble, neglected and broken. Its condition reflected the unity or disunity of the nation behind it. And yet, even when neglected, it endured. The earth did not forget the shape it had been pressed into, and the stones still clung to the ridges. Nature, though fierce, respected its stubbornness. The wall's symbolic power reached beyond defense. It defined boundaries, not only between lands, but between chaos and order, between safety and the unknown. For those who lived behind it, the wall marked the edge of civilization, a line beyond which the world grew wild. For those who approached from the other side, it was both a challenge and a warning. That within lay a people organized, enduring, and watchful. But over time, the wall also became a symbol of human connection rather than separation. The very roads built to supply it turned into trade routes. Merchants followed the line of watchtowers, carrying goods and stories from east to west. Cultures met at its gates, exchanged ideas, languages, and traditions. What began as a barrier slowly became a thread, binding together lands it was once meant to divide. For the soldiers who guarded it, the wall represented duty. For the builders, it was labor. For emperors, it was power. But for history, it became a quiet testament to endurance, proof that the human spirit, though fragile, can create something lasting through patience and unity. The wall endures not because it was perfect, but because it was persistent. Its endurance is all the more remarkable when one remembers the tools that built it: wooden spades, woven baskets, ropes, and bare hands. No cranes, no engines, no modern scaffolding. The same earth that resisted the builders eventually became their ally. The soil they packed turned to stone. The land they shaped held its form for millennia. The wall's continued presence, weathered but strong, is a message across time that greatness is born not from power alone, but from collective effort sustained through generations. Even when dynasties fell and wars swept across the land, the wall remained. It outlasted emperors, invasions, and eras of silence. Wind and sand wore it down, yet never erased it. Villagers built their homes from its bricks. Travelers traced its path like a memory. In every age, it served a new purpose: defense, communication, heritage. The Great Wall adapted, as if alive. To walk along its ridges today is to feel that endurance. The stones are cold underfoot, the wind strong, the view endless. In that vastness, one senses the thousands of hands that shaped it, the shared rhythm of effort that bound an empire together. Each tower, each curve of the wall, is a mark of unity carved into the land itself. In quiet moments, when the mountains glow under the morning sun and the valleys below still sleep, the wall seems less like a fortification and more like a whisper of history. It tells a story of people who believed in building something larger than themselves, who worked not for reward but for legacy. And perhaps that is why it has endured when so much else has vanished. The Great Wall stands because it was never only stone and earth. It was vision, collaboration, and patience. It was the embodiment of an idea that through unity and shared endurance, even the wildest landscapes could be tamed, and even the longest centuries could be crossed. In the end, the Great Wall's true strength lies not in its height or its length, but in what it represents: the power of human cooperation, the will to persist, and the belief that together, people can build something that lasts beyond time. When the first stretches of the Great Wall were built, they were little more than lines of packed earth running across the ridges of northern China. Yet century after century, dynasty after dynasty, the wall evolved, rebuilt, expanded, strengthened, and sometimes forgotten. Like a living thing, it grew, decayed, and was reborn, reflecting the fortunes of the empires it guarded. To trace its history is to trace the rise and fall of the Chinese state itself, each generation leaving its mark upon the stones. The earliest forms of the wall appeared long before the unification of China during the chaotic warring states period. Then, the land was divided among rival kingdoms, each fearful of invasion from its neighbors and from the nomadic horsemen who rode across the northern plains. These first walls were made of earth and timber, practical, quick to build, and suited to local terrain. They served not as monuments, but as boundaries, defining the reach of power. When Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BCE, he inherited several of these walls and saw in them an opportunity. For the first time, the scattered fortifications could be joined into a single line of defense. Under his command, hundreds of thousands of laborers, soldiers, peasants, and prisoners were sent north to connect and extend the walls. Using the rammed earth technique perfected over centuries, they pressed layer upon layer of soil into ridges that followed the mountains and valleys. The result was a continuous barrier stretching for thousands of miles. The first Great Wall, the Qin Wall, was crude by later standards, but revolutionary in concept. It represented a unified vision of defense, symbolizing the emperor's control over a vast land. Watchtowers, gates, and beacon systems were added, linking the empire's armies through sight and smoke. The Wall of the Qin, however, was short-lived in its pristine state. After the emperor's death, rebellion and civil war swept the empire, and the maintenance of such an immense structure became impossible. The wind and rain began their slow erosion. The Han Dynasty, which followed, rebuilt and extended the wall farther west. Their purpose was not only defense but trade. The wall now guarded the routes of the Silk Road, protecting caravans carrying silk, spices, and ideas between China and distant lands. The Han added fortresses, outposts, and administrative centers along the line, transforming the frontier into a bustling network of life. Where once soldiers had stood in lonely isolation, traders, messengers, and settlers now mingled. The wall became both shield and artery, keeping dangers out while allowing commerce and culture to flow through. In the centuries that followed, periods of strength and decline left their marks upon the wall. When the empire was secure, maintenance waned. When the frontier was threatened, new sections were raised again. The Northern Wei, the Sui, and the Tang each rebuilt parts of it, adapting its design to new needs. During these ages, the wall was less a single structure than a collection of fortifications, watchtowers, and military colonies, a flexible system responding to shifting threats. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century brought great changes. The powerful horsemen of the steppe crossed easily through gaps in the old walls, sweeping deep into the heart of China. When the Yuan dynasty was established under Mongol rule, the need for the wall diminished. For nearly a century, it was neglected, its stones left to weather in silence. Grass grew where soldiers once stood, and the wind whispered through abandoned towers. Then came the Ming dynasty in the 14th century, a new era of rebuilding and ambition. The Ming emperors saw the wall not only as a defense, but as a symbol of their strength and legitimacy. Over 2 centuries, they transformed it into the form most familiar today, the long, sinuous structure of brick and stone that crowns the mountains north of Beijing. Unlike the earthen ramparts of earlier dynasties, the Ming Wall was engineered with remarkable precision. Bricks were baked in kilns near the construction sites, stones were quarried from nearby hills, and lime mortar bound them together with enduring strength. Watchtowers were rebuilt at regular intervals, their roofs tiled and their windows fitted for archers. Large fortresses, some the size of small towns, anchored the line at strategic passes. Within these, barracks, stables, and granaries housed garrisons ready to respond to threats at a moment's notice. The beacon system was refined to an art: smoke by day, fire by night, mirrors for sunlight signals, and flags for coded messages. With favorable winds, a warning could travel hundreds of kilometers in a few hours, but even the Ming Wall was not uniform. In some places, it was a majestic stone rampart, broad enough for horses to ride across its top. In others, it remained a simple earth mound or trench. The materials always followed the land. Where granite was plentiful, stone ruled. Where clay dominated, brick and earth prevailed. Yet the unity of purpose, to guard the northern frontier, bound every section together as time passed. The wall became less about battle and more about presence. The very sight of it was a deterrent, a statement of stability. Villages and markets grew along its base. Farmers cultivated the protected valleys, and trade flourished through its gates. For centuries, it stood not only as a defense against outsiders, but as a reassurance to those within, a visible promise that the empire's reach extended even to the edge of the wilderness. However, history continued its turning. When the Ming dynasty weakened in the 17th century, internal strife and corruption sapped its strength. The wall, despite its grandeur, could not stop the tide of the Manchu armies who crossed it and founded the Qing dynasty. Once again, the frontier shifted and the wall lost its military significance. The new rulers did not need to rely on its defenses. They looked beyond it, expanding the empire into the very lands it had once guarded against. For centuries after, the wall slept. Its towers fell silent, its stones worn smooth by wind and rain. Villagers took bricks to build homes. Farmers plowed fields across its base, and herders led their flocks through its broken gates. Yet even in decay, it endured. Its shape still traced the horizon. Its shadow still stretched across the hills. Travelers and poets began to see it not as a fortification, but as a monument to perseverance, a relic of human ambition etched into the landscape. In the modern age, the wall found new life again. Scholars studied its routes. Archaeologists uncovered forgotten sections buried by time, and restoration began on its most famous stretches. No longer a line of war, it became a line of memory, a bridge between past and present. Tourists walked where soldiers once patrolled, and the echo of footsteps along its stones spoke of admiration rather than fear. Through all these transformations, from defense to decay, from neglect to renewal, the wall remained constant in one sense. It continued to represent endurance, whether guarded by armies or watched by travelers. Whether whole or broken, it spoke the same truth, that human hands, guided by patience and purpose, can shape the land itself into something lasting. Every dynasty that touched the wall left a layer of history upon it, like sediment laid down by time. The earth of the Qin, the stone of the Han, the brick of the Ming, all still exist, side by side, along its endless spine. And so, when one looks upon the Great Wall today, one does not see a single monument, but 1,000 years of effort, hope, and adaptation woven together. It has changed with every century, but it has never truly vanished. Like the empire it once defended, it has fallen and risen again, carrying forward the memory of all who built it. Every great monument gathers stories around it, and the Great Wall of China, with its vast reach and silent endurance, has inspired more tales than most. For over 2,000 years, travelers, poets, soldiers, and villagers have looked upon its endless path and wondered who built it, why it was made, and what secrets it might still hold beneath its stones. While historians measure its bricks and chart its miles, ordinary people have always measured it in stories, tales of love, loss, and loyalty whispered from one generation to the next. Perhaps the most famous of all is the legend of Meng Jiangnu, the woman whose tears brought down the wall. It is said that during the time of the Qin dynasty, when the first emperor ordered the unification of the walls, countless men were taken from their homes to labor in the north. Among them was a newly married husband, who was seized from his wedding celebration and sent to the frontier before his bride could even say goodbye. Months passed. When winter came and snow fell across the villages, the young wife, Meng Jiangnu, grew worried. She sewed warm clothes for her husband and began the long journey north to find him, walking for weeks through mountains and cold winds. But when she reached the construction site, she was told the terrible truth. Her husband had died from exhaustion, and his body had been buried beneath the wall itself. Heartbroken, she wept for days beside the stones. Her grief was so deep, the legend says, that the heavens took pity on her. The ground trembled, and a great section of the wall collapsed, revealing the bones of the dead beneath. Meng Jiangnu buried her husband properly, then vanished from the earth. Some say she threw herself into the sea, others that she turned into stone, forever guarding the memory of those who suffered. This story, told and retold for centuries, transformed the Great Wall from a symbol of power into one of compassion and humanity. It reminded people that behind the emperor's command were countless lives, anonymous laborers whose strength and sacrifice built the foundation of empire. Even emperors were said to weep when hearing her tale, for it spoke of love stronger than fear and sorrow deeper than authority. Other legends grew in the shadow of the wall, blending myth with memory. Some said that dragons had guided its path, mighty celestial serpents that wound across the land, showing builders where the wall should follow. They believed that to defy the dragon's route would bring disaster, so the wall was made to follow its natural curves, climbing ridges and descending valleys just as a dragon would slither through the mountains. Even today, locals refer to it as the dragon that lies upon the land. Another story tells of the ghosts of the dead who still guard the wall. Because so many lives were lost during its construction, soldiers, peasants, and prisoners, people believed that their spirits lingered to protect the border they had died for. At night, travelers spoke of seeing pale lights flickering along the towers, as though watchfires still burned where no one lived. The wind, moaning through cracks in the stone, was said to be the voices of those who never went home. To the superstitious, this was not frightening but comforting. The wall was alive, watched over by those who built it.in villages near the wall. Smaller stories blossomed, tales of hidden treasure buried beneath the stones, of secret tunnels that led to forgotten chambers, of lovers who carved their names into bricks to ensure they would be remembered. Some stories told of bandits who disguised themselves as builders to sneak into fortresses, others of hermits who lived in abandoned watchtowers, meditating above the clouds. During the Ming Dynasty, when the wall was rebuilt in stone, soldiers stationed at lonely outposts filled their long nights with stories. Around their campfires, they imagined that the wall stretched beyond the horizon, circling the entire world. Some claimed that its length connected heaven and earth, that it was built not only by men, but with the guidance of the stars. When shooting stars streaked across the sky, soldiers said they were sparks falling from the celestial wall that mirrored their own on earth. Folklore also gave meaning to the natural sounds of the wall, the cry of the wind. Through its towers was believed to be the lament of the ancient builders. The creak of shifting stones at night was said to be the wall whispering secrets to itself, remembering every hand that touched it. In some regions, families offered small bowls of rice or incense to the wall before traveling through its gates, asking it to protect them from misfortune. Poets, too, added to its mythology. In verse after verse, the wall appeared as a symbol of both endurance and solitude. Tang poets wrote of soldiers who died far from home, watching the northern lights above the frontier. Song poets compared the wall to the human heart, strong on the outside, vulnerable within. Even when the empire was at peace, the Great Wall remained a reminder of effort, distance, and longing. Over the centuries, these stories blurred the line between truth and imagination. Historians studied the wall's structure, while storytellers gave it a soul. And perhaps both were right. For in every great work of human hands, there are two walls, one of stone and one of memory. The first can crumble, but the second lives on through stories that end this way. The wall became part of Chinese identity not only through its size, but through its voice. The story of Meng Jiangnu reminded people of compassion. The tale of the dragon spoke of harmony with nature. The ghost lights of the towers told of loyalty that outlasted death. Together, these legends transformed the Great Wall from a physical defense into a spiritual one, guarding not only the land but the imagination of the people. Even today, when visitors walk along its battlements, guides and locals still whisper fragments of these tales. They point to the curves of the wall and say, "See how it follows the dragon's spine." They speak of the weeping woman whose tears still glisten on the stones after rain. They talk of the glow seen on moonless nights. When the past seems to stir, it is fitting that a structure meant to separate people instead became a source of shared stories. Across generations, emperors and peasants, scholars and soldiers, travelers and poets all found meaning in the same stones. The wall, once a line of division, became a thread of connection, linking memory, myth, and history into one long, unbroken story. And so, the Great Wall endures not only in the earth, but in words, told beside fires, written in poems, and carried in whispers along the wind that still moves over its peaks. Tonight, as we leave behind the quiet ridges and long shadows of the Great Wall, it's worth pausing to remember what it truly represents. It is easy to look upon its stones and see only defense, a wall meant to divide, to keep danger out. Yet beneath that idea lies something deeper, something softer, the unbroken patience of countless hands, the endurance of a people who refuse to yield to time or to the elements. For over 2,000 years, the wall has watched seasons pass, snow falling upon its peaks, wind brushing against its battlements, grass reclaiming its edges. It has seen empires rise and fade, soldiers come and go, and still it stands, quiet as a mountain, patient as the earth itself. Its builders are long gone, their names forgotten, yet their rhythm remains. Pressed into every layer of stone and soil, the Great Wall was never only about strength. It was about connection, linking provinces, people, and centuries through shared effort. It was about trust, that what one generation began, another would continue. It was about endurance, the belief that through unity, even mountains could be moved, even deserts could be crossed. And in its silence, the wall continues to teach. It reminds us that greatness does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, in the wind that slips between old stones, in the footsteps of travelers walking where history still breathes. It reminds us that what endures is not only what is built, but what is remembered. When we look upon the Great Wall today, stretching beyond the horizon, we are not simply seeing a monument of the past. We are seeing a conversation across time, between laborers and emperors, between the living and the dead, between the world that was and the one that still continues. It endures because it was born from patience. It speaks because it was shaped by countless voices. And it stands because the hands that built it believed that something made together could outlast them all. Thank you for joining this calm journey through history. If you enjoyed this quiet story of endurance and human will, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can return for more gentle explorations into the forgotten corners of the past. Good night.